All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We wish we could be gathering in person around our usual Farmers Guild potlucks, but we will be zooming instead. So appreciate you showing up this evening. My name is Evan Wigg. I'm with CAFF, Community Alliance of Family Farmers. For those of you who don't know, we're an organization based all over California that for over 4 decades has supported family farms, sustainable agriculture, and local food systems. And this evening's topic is really close to our organization as well as close to my heart, which is really looking at community partnerships as they relate to climate change. What can we do to connect the dots to address climate change in a way that's proactive, positive, and really recognizes the value of leveraging those relationships within our food system from field to plate. So everyone has a role to play. That's what I really love about this evening's topic is that no matter who you are, whether you're just a committed eater who recognizes the need to address climate change, or if you're a farmer out in the field wondering how your practices and land management can become a solution for climate change and to reduce those greenhouse gas effects. So it's really great and hopeful. I think we all need a little bit of hope right now, and I can't think of anything more hopeful than the realization that the solution is right underneath our feet in the ground, and all comes down to how we manage it and our relationship to the soil. So we are just gonna let's see. All right, I'm gonna let you know who's here in the room. This is great. So as you can see, we've got quite a number of farmers and ranchers here. A couple folks from the food industry, a couple farm service providers, and a good number of eaters. So I appreciate the eaters, the service providers, the food industry, chefs, restaurants, and of course to the farms and ranches. It's great to see a nice mix of people here tonight. So what I encourage you guys to do before we dive into this evening's presentation is in the chat, feel free to drop in questions for our presenters or share resources that are related to this evening's content. And before we dive in a little further, I'm just going to let you all know that we, as a Sonoma County chapter of CAFF, we meet regularly, both in terms of our policy advocacy. So we advocate at the county and city level for policies that support the kinds of regenerative agriculture we're going to hear about tonight, as well as just trying to encourage the viability of small family farms. And then, of course, we provide educational resources like you're experiencing right now. So if anybody is interested in being a part of these, make sure you're obviously on the mailing list to get those invitations. But if you want to learn more about the chapter or how to get involved, or even to dive in a little bit more on the policy side of things and help us give voice to the small family farmers who rarely have an opportunity to show up to those meetings and be heard, let us know. Get in touch. Wendy Krupnick, our acting president, is here. Wave, Wendy. Thanks for being here. You probably all know Wendy. She's everywhere and at all times. She's omnipresent in this county. So we're blessed to have Wendy here at the CAFF community. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this evening's presentations. We're joined by Ryan Johnston, who's with Ridge RCD working on carbon farming plans, and Anthony Myint from ZeroFoodprint, who's going to talk about this really new, exciting development that provides resources for farmers to make that transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture. Most farms that we work with, they want to make that transition, but it does take some resources and resources that not all farms have. So this is about a community collective investment in making that transition. The burden of transitioning to a climate smart agricultural system, which is a massive undertaking, but also a vital undertaking, shouldn't be only on the shoulders of farmers, right? It really needs to be a collective responsibility and therefore collective duty. So that investment needs to come from our farms, from our policymakers, from our taxpayers, and in this case, from chefs, restaurants, and eaters who recognize they can make a really big difference with their fork when it comes to the future of our food system and our planet. So let's pass on. We're starting out with was it Ryan? You're getting started. No, sorry, Anthony. Anthony's getting started. Thank you, Wendy. All right, Anthony, you want to take it from here? Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And thanks for your great work, both land stewardship and community organizing. Sorry, just everybody can hear me. It's okay. Cool. Sorry, I thought you were looking down, Evan.
Sound great.
So I wanted to just give a quick background first. My background is as a chef, restaurateur. We began doing pop-ups in San Francisco before that was even a term. Turned into a permanent pop-up. We, became successful here. We opened a location in New York. Ostensibly, it was in a shitty Thai takeout window, and miraculously, that restaurant won New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012. And so we found ourselves kind of in these celebrity chef circles, somewhat unearned from like a Michelin perspective or whatever. But fast forward several years, my wife and I had a daughter, and we just started thinking a lot about climate change in the future and really wanting to make our work part of the solution. So that took two forms. One is the nonprofit that I'm going to present today, ZeroFoodprint. But I want to take a quick diversion to the other manifestation, which was a restaurant we were running called The Perennial. And we were trying to go basically like hyper farm to table. We were sourcing, this perennial grain kernza from the Land Institute in the Midwest. We were serving, beef and dairy from Marin Carbon Project pilots, like here in our backyard, where, scientists were kind of proving out the world-saving potential of soil carbon and regenerative ag. And, just for reference, like some of the pilot programs, like on a 10th of Stemple Creek Ranch, were taking in as much carbon after a few years as not burning 1 million gallons of gas. So, I mean, just like huge, huge potential. But of course, to apply compost, to do the managed grazing, to do all that work, it's like several $100,000 worth of work that the food system doesn't offer, to farmers and ranchers. There's no way you could borrow, $500,000, apply a bunch of compost or something like that, take carbon out of the atmosphere with your carbon farming, and then charge enough money to recoup that somehow, much less that your neighbor would do that, much less that the whole food system would start changing on 760 million acres of rangeland and millions of acres of cropland. I think at some point a soil scientist was saying at a happy hour, like, you realize after 50 years or whatever, the whole organic movement is 2% of farmland, 3% of farmland, right? And so we just started to things started to crystallize, and we started to work on more systemic change. So that's part of why I'm here. And that began a collaboration with the state of California, the Department of Food and Ag, and Air Resources Board, and also like the resource conservation districts. Let me know if you're seeing kind of a rainbow looking thing on screen share.
Looks great.
Cool. Thanks. So also just as we were learning all this stuff, scientists and climate experts were also sort of making a lot of progress. So a project that came out in 2017 is called Project Drawdown, and they analyzed like 80 different climate solutions, and it ranges from like food waste to renewable energy to educating girls to regenerative ag. And what they found is amazing. 1% of GDP used each year on the best climate solutions could lower global temperatures by 2050. So that's like so optimistic to me, and kind of flips the whole script from like stop doing the things you like, or we're screwed, or whatever, to just like how fast can we fund solutions? And it's not even that much funding. We only need to make, instead of like 100.0% extraction, let's just switch to 99% extraction, 1% regeneration, we're good. That is compelling to me. The other thing that's compelling is, food and ag, changing food systems. This graph is based on the opportunity, so not the source of emissions, but how much progress we can make. So they take the whole solution set of what's plausible. And so food systems are 24% of what's plausible, and land stewardship is 24%. And you add that up, that's more than electricity, transportation, and all these things that get all the attention. So even though food and farming is like the biggest solution, it gets the least attention. And then the last thing they found is regenerative cropping and managed grazing, and some of these solutions that we all know and love and understand. They provide about $40 of benefit for each dollar invested. So biggest solution, least mobilized solution, super beneficial for local communities. So we began this program, and the vision was basically to utilize some of the same frameworks that are already successful for renewable energy. And so, you imagine this problem, we have to change the whole energy grid. How are we going to do that? Is it people taking out loans to put up solar panels? They have to climb on the roof. So is the answer to just like yell at them and shame them and try and make them do that stuff? Or is the solution to find a streamlined, seamless, like no friction way? And so in 2014, there started, after like decades of policy work, started to be a program called community choice aggregation. And we understand that as consumers and citizens, very simply is just like, oh yeah, you put a few bucks per month on your utilities bill to improve the grid. This idea of improving the grid, like that almost seems like a no-brainer. If you try to explain it to someone, they're like, yeah, what am I, stupid? Of course I understand that. Yet there is not a way to improve the grid of farming. And there needs to be. There should just be a way to improve the grid of farming. We need to change half the system, the whole system, like a really big and challenging thing. Let's just start improving the grid with money. And so that was the vision. And, state of California, our vision, let's establish a renewable food economy. But rather than a few bucks on the utilities bill, it's a 1% fee added to restaurants. It's $1 per month on the waste hauling bill. And you can imagine, just like the same way renewable energy probably seemed impossible in 1980, and now it's inevitable, that we can just make this change. If the Sonoma restaurant industry, for example, added a 1% fee, that would have been $8 million a year for carbon farming pre-COVID. If you tack on $1 per month from waste haulers, that's another $2 million bucks. So you can see how you could start, like the county could start moving towards its target in the climate action plan and all these things. Basically just that government is trying to solve climate change and work on solutions, and there's not enough money. Meanwhile, we have citizens, consumers, et cetera, who want climate solutions, and there's not a way. So we're trying to create this way in Sonoma and across California, but we just really like very early days in this work. So we just started in awarding grants in 2020. So far, we've awarded 325,000 grants to 18 projects across the state, expected to remove 7,000 tons of carbon. So that's equivalent to not burning about 800,000 gallons of gas. So you can see how like money just turns into climate solutions in real life. But the great thing about Sonoma is that we were able to get a grant from an anonymous foundation or anonymous family donor. And so we have like a grant to do quite a lot of work in Sonoma specifically. And so that's the purpose of this call. So we've awarded a little over $100,000 so far, and there's about $200,000 still available in the coming rounds of grants. So I'm going to get into the grant program and I'll pop the application URL and stuff into the chat later. I'll try to breeze through the process, and sorry for like so much information, but and also sorry for arrows flying in. Someone else made this chart for me, but so the farmers and renters apply. We're working closely with the Sonoma and Ridge RCDs on it. CAFF would also be a great technical service provider on it. We haven't had applications coming in from CAFF so far, but hopefully this is the start. So basically, farmers and renters apply. We have a selection process, which I'll explain in a moment. Farmers and renters get half the funds up front, and they get the second half afterwards, after the project is complete. If for whatever reason somebody's lacking in cash flow, you can just invoice us for the second half. So if you want to have like that compost company, just send us the bill, or the seed company, or whatever it might be. ZeroFoodprint retains 5% of the fees coming in for operating, and that's somewhat insufficient, but we're funded currently through a conservation innovation grant from the NRCS. Actually, the URL's here. So if you're on the screen, it's our website, zerofoodprint.org/apply. We just opened a grant round in March 1st, and it closes April 22nd. So please do apply. So I'm going to get into the selection process, but in order to do that, I'm just going to show this screen capture from carbon sequestration modeling tool called the Comet Planner. And so I'll pop the URL for this in the chat later too. But basically, it's almost like a mortgage calculator. It's a really simplified tool that just allows anyone to estimate the carbon farming benefit from a given practice. So this is a screen capture from a compost application project on grazed grassland. And there's actually a picture. So we did a project with Tresh's, and they requested $20,000 to apply compost on 23 acres. And so I think this actually speaks towards something Evan said, which was, it's a great program to help conventional ranchers transition to regenerative, which it is. It's also a great program to help a sustainable, well-regarded and beloved producer do one more step. And so in a way, this is like a very non-judgmental, program. It's not a purity contest. It's really just funding continual improvement and trying to create like a renewable food economy that funds healthy soil. But so you can see here, this amount is what CDFA would provide to an applicant if someone were lucky enough to get a grant from CDFA after filling out, many hours of Healthy Soils program application work. Our program's really simple. It's like a 10 or 15-minute application. And the main difference here is that the applicant is asked to name their own price for the project. So you could bid the full price, exactly everything you need. You could bid even more, covering like, your time and energy and bandwidth and stuff. Or you could bid less if you're going to get a lot of co-benefits, or, in this case, like if someone is donating a bunch of compost to you or whatever, you have some way to make it cheaper, you can bid less. And so this works well for cost sharing, for EQIP and some other programs like that. But basically farmers and ranchers name their price and then we sort it out. And so that's what's going on here. And so sorry, this slide's a little bit complicated, but I think it's useful to just run through it with you, and I'll pause after this for any questions and to maybe explain anything about the application process. I forgot if we're doing questions after the individual parts. But basically, a farmer and rancher applies. This is the county they're in, the practices they're doing, the acres of the practices, the total carbon sequestration as modeled by Myint. This is the grant request from the farmer. This is the technical service provider working on the project. This is the bid or the fee or whatever that the TSP or TAP needs to oversee the project and to kind of validate it after the fact that it was completed. And so there's a total cost. And then we basically just divide the total cost by the total carbon to get what we internally refer to as the climate ROI, or the tons of carbon removal per dollar. So that's in this column. So we sort all the projects by this column, and then we apply bonuses if the participating farm, if the applicant is in the supply chain of one of the participating businesses, you get a little boost up the queue. Likewise, if you're an underserved farmer or rancher, you get a bonus and boost up the queue. So that's basically like, a really rough kind of peek under the hood at how the program works. But basically, I hope that this helps communicate that, well, what we're doing is basically a systematic approach to improving land stewardship. And that, when we're talking about improving the grid of energy, this really is a little bit analogous to that, in that if a government was putting in $1 million, if a consumer or a restaurant is putting in $1, they can rest assured that it's going to like a systematic change of land. It's not just like a donation to one random person or whatever. It's not just like helping the farmer, make ends meet, which is crucial too, but that's just not what this is. This is specifically funding the practices that have the best climate impact. And, we understand that there's many potential great benefits for healthy soil, like biodiversity and, resilience and water conservation and all that. For us, we began as a climate organization, and this is really kind of trying to activate the opportunity for citizens and consumers and businesses to take local climate action. And so our focus for the program is carbon, although we like totally, are diehard believers of regenerative ag and healthy soil and stuff. So I feel like I should pause there. And I don't know if apologize, I forgot if we were doing questions after everybody, or if it makes sense to have a few questions now and then like more at the end if needed.
Yeah, let's go ahead and let's go ahead and pass the mic over to Ryan, and we'll dive into a conversation with a little Q&A. How's that sound? Ryan, you ready to roll? All right, so Ryan Johnston, formerly of Ethics Ciders, currently working with Biotic Beverage, and also working with the Ridge RCD. Really great resource we have here in our community. We did a tour with CAFF out at an orchard with him, talking about their carbon farming plan, and it was one of the best field days we ever did. So really grateful to have Ryan here talking about how this fits, and I really like this image that's about to happen here. I don't know what it is, but I'm excited to find out what it is.
I'm gonna actually ask for a little technical support on the fly here. My slides are advancing on their own, and I didn't ask for that. Can anyone point me to how to take that mode off?
Maybe go to slideshow or
uncheck that box that says use timings. Right, yeah.
All right.
All right, start for
Community source solutions. Cool. All right. Well, nice to be here with everyone at a distance. Yeah, as Evan shared, my background is in food and beverage, and also now working with Ridge RCD. So I have the experience of developing a carbon farm plan from the producer side when I was working at Ethic Ciders, which was a local cider company putting regenerative farming kind of at the core of our cider offerings. And I'm now working with my family business, Biotic Beverages. So I'm a co-owner there, and I run that with my dad and brother. And we produce probiotic beverages down in Petaluma. And that same spirit has very much carried through. In a lot of ways, I brought that passion to this business to work on our supply chain there as well. And I'll touch on that a little bit toward the end of it. But the majority of my time this evening will be kind of walking through that carbon farm planning process. I'm a carbon conservation planner with Ridge RCD, and I work there 1 day a week at this point, but I'm super grateful to keep a foot in that world and support producers in this way, which is an absolute passion of mine for many of the reasons that have already been stated. To me, it's one of the most hopeful things going out there. So I've got some simple graphics, hopefully conveys what that planning process looks like, and then we can certainly dive deeper in the Q&A at the end. But yeah, I mean, I think we've been airing the dirty laundry on climate change for a long time. I don't think anyone, everyone who's here this evening is well aware of what we're facing. And, for a culture that idolizes disruptive technologies as much as we do, I think it's maybe no surprise that we have this like mother of all disruption going on. And it really does create this existential crisis of sorts. And I was an environmental studies major in college, and coming out of that was tending a lot of grief and complete overwhelm. And I was, a super negative person as a result of that. And finding my way into these natural system solutions has kind of turned its world on its head. And I pursued that in my professional career for the 10 years since. And what I love about this work is, I acknowledge we need policy change. We do need technological change, but I think there's an incredible amount of innovation that is going to come from the grassroots up, farm by farm, community by community, region by region. And I love what ZeroFoodprint is doing in the spirit of that. And I'm a big believer as well that action dispels despair, right? And hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And so, how do we as communities start addressing this right where we live? And I think regenerative agriculture and carbon farming has a huge role to play in that. So just kind of at a high level, the things we'll be talking about this evening, we're looking at them through these three lenses. Mitigation is how do we reduce greenhouse gases, lessen the footprint of that, and then how do we also create adaptation within the system as well? So we're particularly looking at solutions that meet the overlap of those two Venn diagrams. Spreading compost on rangeland is a great example of that. You get the benefit of sequestered carbon, helping on the mitigation side of things, but as Anthony mentioned, it also holds more water in the soil then, which is a great adaptation method for a rapidly changing climate and kind of weirder weather patterns. And I think all of this, it's important to say that we have to bring, and I think there's a growth edge to bring an equity lens to this work as well, and really support the underserved communities as we make this transition as well. And that shows up in a number of different ways. And I do want to acknowledge the funding partners we're going to talk about give preferential treatment to the historically disadvantaged communities, but oftentimes there is assumptions then that there is land access, or that there's, the long-term land access that's oftentimes required to undertake some of these practices. And I also want to underscore that, the burden or the risk of making these transitions are oftentimes unfairly borne by the farmers themselves. And so how do we as a community show up and more equally spread that risk and find new innovative funding mechanisms to, again, spread that risk out? Because a farmer who has done chemical agriculture, say, or a high tillage system, if they make these changes, the reality is they're probably going to see their yields go down for 1, 2, 3, 5 years maybe as they get the flywheel spinning, and then get back up to healthy systems dynamics. But during that period, like, how do we support them collectively as a community to make that transition, because we're all benefiting from it? And again, in two sort of broad buckets, the carbon farming practices we'll be touching on this evening kind of fall into two camps. There's the sequester more. How do we take living system solutions to take carbon dioxide and to some degrees methane out of the atmosphere and then pull it back into the soil through living systems? And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then release less as well. A good deal of what is driving climate change is actually carbon that's coming out of our soils or has been released from the soils. And in a really simple way, when there's over tillage or when tillage occurs, and I don't mean to villainize tillage altogether, but it's important to understand the dynamic. When tillage occurs, there's a rapid burst of oxygen that gets pulled into the soil, and there's an oxidative process, which is essentially like combustion, and it's literally burning CO2 out of our soils and releasing it back into the atmosphere. So there is a place for tillage in our ag systems, but putting that back into right relationship and doing that with that in mind. So some concrete examples, and there's certainly more than this, but on the sequester and more side of things, compost applications for existence, exogenous carbon going into the system, which is ultimately leading to more photosynthesis, cover crops, hedgerows, things that I think most people on this call are quite familiar with. And then the release less side of things, supporting producers to move to full no-till or at least reduce tillage, supporting with residue management or mulching, which basically keeps the soil covered for longer periods of time so the sun isn't beating on it, and again, oxidizing carbon up into the atmosphere. And then, while it doesn't necessarily fall within the carbon farm plans always, we at the RCD do support people in getting grants for equipment upgrades, say, for increasing fuel efficiency, or supporting with better manure management systems as well to reduce things like methane. And Anthony mentioned Comet Planner earlier as well, and there's a California version of that. So, either follow that link he shared, or you can do a quick Google search of CA Comet Farmer, and it gives you that table that he pulled up earlier. And I think for any producer, I think it's a nice way to start playing with understanding the relative impact of these different practices when applied on acreage, and kind of calculate out the carbon benefits of that. This is going to be review for probably many folks on the call, but because culturally we are becoming carbon literate, I think it's important to underscore this and make sure that everybody is on board. So, in our middle school science classes, we all probably learned that plants photosynthesize, and they use water, and they use carbon and sunlight, and they produce sugars, which become carbohydrates. What isn't talked about, and I didn't learn until I was an adult, but I think is one of the most inspiring phenomena in nature, is that something like 30 to 70% of the carbon that trees or grasses are producing actually get pushed down into the soil to feed the soil life, what Christine Jones calls the liquid carbon pathway. So just by the act of plants growing within healthy living soils, they are actually sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and pushing it down and excreting it out into the soil, which is essentially their digestive system, right? And there's a whole community of life down there that they're working alongside with. Something like 90% of the nutrients that go into a plant, again, in a healthy organic system, soluble fertilizers is kind of a separate conversation, but 90% of those nutrients pass through the microbiology of the soil to become soluble to plants. So you can imagine they're creating the sugar, they're tacking on a little amino acid, and then they're excreting that chocolate cake out into the soil to feed the fungi and bacteria. And those different amino acids are signaling, saying, hey, I need the copper solubilizer to show up, for instance, and break that out of the base of the soil and make it available to the plants. And then, of course, in doing so, you're moving CO2 down into the soil into a more stable form. And, when played out through a long period of time, you're literally recarbonizing soils, as we're seeing in an example, a side-by-side, something like this. But again, this takes quite a long time. So the carbon farm planning process, as ERCD walks folks through, basically our funding comes through the National Resource Conservation Service, which is within the USDA, and we've gotten a partner grant, which is their Regional Conservation Partnership Program, to support landowners in walking through this process, which essentially, we go out on the landscape with the farmers and talk with them about their resource concerns and their goals. And this might be related to resource issues very specifically, or it might mean that they're looking to, start a college education fund, or set up systems to hand this farm off to the next generation. Those sort of lifestyle pieces are also included in this. We support with doing a baseline ecological assessment of that landscape, and then starting to match up the goals with the baseline ecological assessment and overlay what these practices might look like on a particular piece of land, and do some of the mapping and planning that's involved there. And then using tools like Comet and other calculators that have been developed, starting to quantify the impact of implementing those practices on a landscape. Oftentimes, there's a lot of practices and people get really excited about it, but it's unrealistic maybe to take those all on. And so there's a prioritization process, both around where you're sort of getting the biggest return for your investment in ecological terms, and also where funding exists. And so with that plan developed, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, then we support the producers with funding and implementation. This might look like technical support of, doing some of the soil sampling out there on the landscape, or finding resources for better cover crop blends, or helping with the actual planning of like, how much compost do I need across this landscape to be more accurate? And then supporting ultimately with the monitoring as well, which, obviously feeds back on this whole process, and it continues through time. Here's just some examples of a farm we worked with in South Sebastopol, kind of walking through this planning process. In the upper left there, kind of assessing the farm as it relates to the 100-year floodplain, and then, a topographic map. Oftentimes, producers don't necessarily have access to high quality maps for their particular landscape. So that alone, I think, is a real benefit that we can bring to a producer, just to bring that high resolution data for the land that they're working on. The third map over from the right, you see the farm fields actually mapped out against the soil types of the farm, again, creating high resolution for the management practices. And in this case, they had never done the mapping to really have a sense of the area of each one of these fields as well. And so when you think about compost application or nutrient application, especially in this case in a floodplain, being more accurate with those amendments is really aided by a map like this and the tables that support it. And then down in the lower right, in this case, there's hedgerows and riparian plantings, and some flood areas that are going to be planted out, bluebird boxes and owl perches that we help do the planning for as well on how to implement those on this landscape. And then this is a similar table to what Anthony shared earlier coming out of Comet Farm. Just looking at these different practices, this is for this specific farm, so you don't see the areas associated with these, but it does give you a relative sense of the magnitude. Okay, well, we could, there's a suite of practices that might be appropriate for our landscape. Which ones are we going to prioritize given our goals, and kind of helping them strategize to work through that. And then looking at this over the long term as well, what is the ultimate impact of this? And then, of course, co-benefits as well. There's some great work out there that really underscores if we focus on carbon alone, we're sort of missing the bigger picture and missing the bigger transition that needs to occur here. And so where possible, helping quantify some of these other co-benefits that might come out of implementing these practices as well. And water retention is probably top of mind for all of us right now, as we seem to be setting up for another drought year. And a 1% increase in organic matter per acre increases the water holding capacity by around 27,000 gallons, which is essentially equivalent to receiving an additional inch of precipitation. So, these, again, small solutions really add up through time. And then nutrient density, I think, is a really exciting one that I want to touch on the bottom here as kind of an emerging opportunity. But, in almost all plans, these co-benefits exist in some capacity. And then I like to think about the Carbon Farm Plan as a sort of living document that is the hub that can then spoke out to numerous funding pools as they emerge. And it can serve as sort of a straw, if you will. You can stick straws out to then sip off of these different funding pools as they're appropriate to then implement your Carbon Farm Plan that sits at the center. So I'm super excited about ZeroFoodprint and the work that they're doing, and creating these innovative funding streams that's then flowing into supporting these carbon farm plans. And historically, NRCS and their EQIP program in particular has funded a lot of these practices, and will soon be funding practices like compost application, which historically they haven't, and CDFA as well at the state level. So there's federal funds and state level funds through the Healthy Soils program and some other programs. And then more and more, we're hearing interest from food companies as well in funding work like this. I don't have any names that I can mention here today, but I'll say we're getting approached by more and more dairies locally and other consumer packaged good companies as well. Basically looking across the landscape of sequestration options and saying, yeah, we could buy forest offsets in some far off place, but that really doesn't align with our ethic. And what we'd like to do is actually reinvest this back into the soil in our local community. And so that is often then flowing into these carbon farm plans as well. And it's really great that we have a bunch of them sort of teed up to say, yeah, we have these plans that are ready and receptive to put that work to root in the ground, if you will. And then carbon markets as well, I think, are an emerging opportunity that's a little bit further out on the horizon. For producers probably in Sonoma County, it's a little bit early for this, but I'm heartened by the trends overall. And I think this will ultimately be a positive, another funding stream that will be flowing into this. So again, having done this on the producer side, I just want to give a couple suggestions when working with agency partners, NRCS, RCDs. It's really important as a producer to kind of start with the end in mind. They're there to support you, but in a lot of ways, it's really important for you to have clear goals of what you're looking to do. And I think the clearer the goals are, the producer, the easier it is for the agency partners to show up. And when the agency partners are walking across the landscape, it's really not their purview to suggest things as much as it is for the producer to say, what if we did this? What if we did this? And it works really well to kind of ask a lot of questions. And then from the RCD side, yes, there's funding for this, or like, ooh, we could support with that, or that's maybe not a possibility. And it's important to know, especially for funding coming through sources like NRCS, that all funding has kind of funding requirements that go along with it. And depending on your operation, it may or may not make sense to engage with something like nutrient management, which on the surface might sound really good, but it's has all these arduous requirements that you have to run through and keep them in the loop on. And so asking about these practice requirements as you're inquiring about the different things that you might do on your farm, keeping the partners informed throughout the process as well. Just kind of like for us at the RCD, we're then working with NRCS upstream as well for funding some of these practices. And so if everybody's in the loop, if plans on the ground change, that helps us accommodate to work with you and make those changes as well. I love what Anthony said about budgeting and helping with the sort of cash flow crunch that can come with a lot of these funding sources historically. So from the state funds and the federal funds, it typically required an outlay of funds from the producer, and then they would get paid back or reimbursed through time, which can be really hard depending on when those expenses hit. And then with all these things, relatively slow moving systems. So being patient, you might develop a carbon farm plan, and it could take a full year plus, or even multiple years before funding becomes available to implement those pieces. I'm excited to say that those loops of time to implementation seem to be getting tighter and tighter, but they do oftentimes move a bit slower than producers might like. So it's important to know that up front. And then, simple graphic, but I think it's something that we should all kind of have an eye on. And just in terms of carbon market trends overall, like I'm heartened to see that there's more volume moving through the carbon markets. The market price per ton is going up and there's more demand for it. Most of it is voluntary at this point, but nonetheless, like that market price seems to be going up and carbon is being bought at higher and higher prices. And then the most exciting part is the sort of technological aspect of this, where there's the cost of validation. So if you are selling carbon on a carbon market, you have to be able to show with some level of accuracy and fidelity that, okay, I've sequestered this carbon into my soil. Those things that we showed earlier, those calculators are proxies for what you might assume you should be able to sequester. But if you're actually selling high quality credits, you have to actually show that that is happening in the landscape. And historically, that meant sending somebody out on the landscape and soil sampling on a regular basis. And so with remote sensing and satellite data, there's really cool new methodologies for validating the carbon and other ecosystem services, which I think will actually create a much greater democratization, and it'll allow smaller and smaller producers to start to enter in and sell carbon credits or ecosystem service credits, ultimately further out on the horizon, which hopefully will be a whole new revenue stream for economic development in rural areas that are supporting these land stewards that are providing this benefit to society as a whole. And then nutrient density, I think, and the work of the Bionutrient Association, which I'm really inspired by, to me, in a lot of ways, this might speed the conversation along faster than anything else on the producer side, or getting consumers excited about investing in higher quality food. Bionutrient Association is, I think, many years into this process, but they're in generation 2 of this little monitor that you see down in the right-hand corner here. And they're building data sets after sampling, for instance, spinach, for many, many farms and many, many different growing practices, to build a data set to say, okay, like, what is quality when it comes to spinach? And there's such a vast difference in the results that they found that quite literally 1 leaf of spinach compared to some of the other leaves of spinach that they measured, 1 leaf of spinach was equivalent to 300 of these other leaves of spinach. And so when you see a differentiation that's this far apart, it creates a real opportunity for market differentiation and communication. And you could only imagine if, mothers across America, across the world, had these devices in their pockets and they were going into the grocery store and evaluating whether or not they wanted to buy the produce, or they're at the farmer's market evaluating if they want to buy the produce with this metric in mind. I think it would radically change our food system for the better, because it's relatively hard. The work that Bionutrient Association seems to be pointing at is it's relatively hard to create crops of that high of nutrient quality without also sequestering carbon. Going back to the conversation we were saying, where 90% of the nutrients going into the plants are passing through the microbiome, and the sequestration and the liquid carbon pathway is supporting that. So this, to me, is a really exciting trend that could really push this whole conversation along in a big way, and hopefully garner the higher prices that people pay for food grown in a better way. And then for us as a small family business, touching on how we've been working on it at Biotic. So we produce probiotic beverages. It's an alternative to kombucha, but instead of using refined sugar, we use root crops to drive our fermentations. In this case, we use beets, and for most of our products, we use carrots. And so within that similar vein of just basically supporting producers that are doing this work, developing direct farm sourcing relationships to work with farmers practicing regenerative agriculture, a pretty straightforward idea. And so we're excited to work with Terra Firma Farm to source our beets now in a more direct way. And as a small brand, this is a small way for us to then engage with the farmers and put more of every dollar spent back in the farmer's pocket, and then get a much higher quality product as well. And so I'm excited about that. Kolokai Farm is where we source our turmeric from, similar sort of thing with a farm out in Hawaii. And then I bring this up in part to also shout out CAFF. We're in early stages of conversation with CAFF of working to identify a family farm in California to source our carrots. By far and away, the most produce that we use by weight is carrots. And so working with CAFF to find a farm that's not only practicing regenerative agriculture practices, but ideally is also minority owned or immigrant owned as well. And so, as a brand, how do we show up and provide long-term growing contracts and a stable market for folks that maybe don't typically have access to that? And then you see down at the bottom, we're a certified B Corp. That happened last year in 2020. And as part of the B Corp community, there's many folks within that are voluntarily committing to net zero 2030, which includes scope 1, scope 2, and most of your scope 3 emissions, which is pretty rigorous as a voluntary effort. But how do we as brands then work to not only offset, but actually inset, working with those partners within our supply chain to maybe invest in other things like hedgerows or more compost applications to generate those carbon credits to help us move toward carbon neutrality. So I'm excited about that trend in general. It's still a ways on the horizon, 2030, and we're just getting started with it. We're just doing our footprinting. But some exciting trends just generally. And the last part as well is giving a shout out to Green Star Farm as well. Food waste is a huge issue, and we take all of our byproducts and turn it, upcycle it basically with no charge to them, but to high quality pastured animal feed that's rich in probiotics and high in fiber as well. So a non-cash way that we're able to support other producers in our community that are doing a really great job managing their pasture and help that carbon flow back into local soils. So I will leave it there. We can maybe transition to Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I mean, it's just, at the intersection of climate change and agriculture and our food system, I think it's a really exciting time. There are so many different solutions, public, private, combinations, grassroots, things that are happening internationally. And so it's really exciting to see all these different solutions taking place right now. And so this is an opportunity to ask a few questions, to jump into a conversation. So if you guys have questions, you can either drop it in the chat and we'll get that read either by Anthony or Ryan or any other folks on the call who might be able to answer your question. Or if you'd prefer to just jump in with a real audio question, I think there's a raise your hand function there as well under the reactions button on the bottom right of your screen. But we're gonna get started. It looks like the questions so far are coming from Anthony to Ryan. So Ryan, is there funding for carbon farm plans from the RCPP? Is there a backlog, wait list, etc., or can anyone just get started ASAP?
I'd say there's both. I mean, I think anybody can jump in with us right away. It might be a little while before we complete the whole plan. We have people throughout the process that are in various stages of their plan. Acknowledging the RCPP, what I didn't mention is that at this point, the RCPP, our funding to support carbon farm planning goes until June. And so if you are interested, I would encourage you to reach out to the RCD prior to that and throw your hat in the ring and just, maybe get in line for one of those plans. We are hoping that they get an extension. We actually have quite a bit more funds that have been allocated. And so if we had a nice long list of people that showed interest in doing that, I think that would help us get an extension on that. Did that answer your question, Anthony?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, Ryan, but does that mean that it's free because it's covered by the RCPP, or is there a cost share element?
There's a cost share element. I think anyone can apply for a waiver to make it free for the planning process. And we're pretty liberal about offering those. But typically there's a 10% cost share, and we have a matrix which we share with folks up front of like how we assess that. It really depends on how complex your plan is. But 10% for most folks, even if it's quite a large landscape that is quite complex, is probably in the hundreds of dollars, not the thousands of dollars, to develop a pretty in-depth carbon farm plan.
Do you know how many counties or regions have that kind of funding? Because it seems almost like too good to be true. It seems amazing that it's just like free to get all this great technical expertise and like have a roadmap of how to, move forward.
I don't know offhand actually of how many counties have that. Through the Carbon Cycle Institute, which is based in Petaluma, also a great resource locally. They host carbon cafes and kind of support this work across the state. And I know there's carbon farm planning efforts happening in dozens of counties across the state, but I'm not actually sure how many of them have the RCPP funding specifically.
Got it.
Anthony, can you tell us what restaurants locally are participating in the ZeroFoodprint project?
So Handline has been a longtime supporter. I think they're getting started again, post-COVID. We put things on pause for a little while and weren't bugging people because it was such a tough time. Lunchette just joined ZeroFoodprint a month ago or pretty recently. And before before COVID, Single Thread was like in process, but they didn't quite get across the finish line. So we're starting up again, kind of in conversation with them. and actually also just seeing if they want to apply for a grant. And so, anyone on this call who's a farmer, I really encourage you to apply for a grant for the same reasons Ryan mentioned, that like, if we have like a long list of farms and ranches looking for grants for carbon farming, it just makes it easier to go out there and try and raise money to fill those plans. If we don't have that list of projects kind of like ready to go, it's all abstract and hypothetical. So make it real and apply. And also more importantly, or just as importantly, like if you sell to a restaurant or sell to a business, just let them know that they can, fund climate solutions with you in Sonoma and sign up for ZeroFoodprint.
That's great. Any other questions from the audience? Here we go. It seems to me that time is of the essence. How are the RCDs streamlining the planning process?
I feel like it's an ongoing dialogue, and we had a good meeting with our NRCS partners last week, and I think it's a bit of a call and response going both directions. If we're doing planning for someone like ZeroFoodprint, and we know that with that in mind, I think we can be a lot more streamlined in some ways. But with the NRCS national requirements, I think there's an ongoing dialogue back and forth of like making sure that the effort we're putting in is all that is needed for their requirements upstream, and then it's all that's needed for the landowners as well, and nothing more. And I'd say there's definitely a lot of opportunity to streamline that, but yeah, I'd say it's a work in process for sure.
And Anthony, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, I'm dying of curiosity to know what, because I've been following ZeroFoodprint for several years now since you started it, and it's always been really exciting. But your whole program is revolves around the restaurant industry, and so 2020 was a pretty tough year for the restaurant industry. So I'm curious, what has that impact been on ZeroFoodprint? What are you guys doing for 2021? And I mean, it's great to see you still here and offering money, and it's so wonderful to see that happening. But I'm wondering, has it changed your thinking at all? Has it changed ZeroFoodprint? Have you made new plans to sort of adapt to the changing world that we have right now?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's like almost comical because I think on March 9th, we got an award from the James Beard Foundation for Humanitarian of the Year. And we were like, oh, this is amazing. Like, we're going to, go crazy now and get all these restaurants on board and stuff. And we booked our plane tickets to the gala and whatever stuff. And then like the next day we were like, oh, cancel the plane tickets, So it's a really tough time in the industry. Many restaurants are closing. We closed our New York location of Mission Chinese and other stuff. There's no question. By the same token, I feel like in the past year, so much has changed, just like in society, that I think we all sort of are more open to basically creating a new normal and to kind of taking collective action for systemic change, and not to like put economics and stuff on the same par as like Black Lives Matter and stuff. But there's like a feeling where, I feel like for me anyway, at least as like kind of a, not as attuned person to those issues, I feel like I had an impulse to kind of be like, I'm not racist, I'm gonna like try not to be racist, whatever, but like kind of passive equity. And then it started to feel like, oh, I get it now, I understand now, like we have to be actively anti-racist, like we have to actively reverse the damage, reverse the system. We have to change the system actively, not just like passively. And so I don't know if I'm the only one, but like, I feel like that has started to be almost like the prevailing sentiment. So my hope is that as we come out of COVID, a lot more restaurants will be up for this kind of systemic change. And, again, if it was like, hey, the $10 sandwich is going to be $20 now, okay, there's a problem there. Hey, the $10 sandwich, we need it to be $10.10 now. And then we can start making like real action, taking real action on climate and healthy soil and stuff. If that's the ask, then it's like a no-brainer to me, and again, pre-COVID in Sonoma, that would have been $8 million a year. So if you just imagine how much carbon farming could get done for that $8 million, if for the sandwich becoming $10.10, it starts to become a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, but we've also opened up and, money from citizens, money from any consumer packaged good, any grocery, any philanthropist. Like, we kind of changed from working with the restaurant industry and trying to get restaurants to become part of the solution to creating this framework with the RCDs and CDFA and everybody to kind of just allow any money to go towards carbon farming and be part of the solution. So, anybody on this call, feel free, help us build this movement. But in Sonoma, we're particularly lucky because we were able to raise a bunch of money to kind of do a focused effort in Sonoma.
Great. So here's another question here, which is an interesting one. So Comet, which was referenced earlier, I believe in Ryan's presentation. Comet is a great tool, though not very accurate. Is this a big concern for ZeroFoodprint and others? What are your thoughts on how much this needs to be addressed, or is it good enough as is? And maybe you can also, for those of us who aren't quite as familiar, just kind of recap what Comet is.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but Ryan's probably a little more expert. So if Ryan wants to recap Comet and then give his thoughts first, that would be great.
So Comet comes out of USDA. It's their proxy data set, basically, for taking the science that's out there to say, the sequestration potential typically for these different practices when implemented. I guess in short, I would say that, yeah, it perhaps is not that accurate, but I would say it's directionally correct. And for what's been talked about here this evening and the importance to get underway with action and kind of let the work on you and let the work on all of us as we kind of refine our strategies as we move forward. I think it absolutely points us in the right direction. There are definitely limitations to it. I think there's limitations that it causes for how the funds flow, especially at the state and federal level. But I think it's directionally correct is what I would say. How do you guys think about it, Anthony?
Yeah, well, my take is when we first began, we were hoping that there would be a carbon market, hoping there would be soil carbon offsets that we could just buy. And we started to understand over time, for multiple reasons, that carbon markets might not solve it. One reason is I think it's yet to be determined if producers sell their carbon credits, if they retain the rights to make climate beneficial claims. I know with like a backpack company or something with renewable energy credits, you sell the renewable energy credits, you can't like put a stamp on the bag or, the label saying like this bag made with renewable energy, because you've literally sold that claim. So carbon markets, I think, work great for a big commodity producer, maybe not necessarily for like a sustainable producer trying to derive a premium for selling climate beneficial goods. I don't know how that will play out, to be completely honest. But what we started to feel is for that reason, and because, basically monitoring costs are expensive, different things, we kind of preferred just a directional good approach. And so again, if someone's paying $10.10 for the sandwich, and they know that 10 cents is like going towards the best directional good, do we really want to tie up like half the resources testing and monitoring after the fact, as opposed to just getting the money flowing in the right direction? But I feel like almost the bigger issue is internality, or the kind of concept of like insets versus offsets. And so oftentimes you run into this thing with like carbon offsets where people are like, that's kind of bullshit, or that's just like, rewarding or enabling bad behavior or this kind of thing. And so in a way, I feel like if, Exxon is trying to like continue polluting and then they're going to fund carbon farming to keep doing that, maybe Comet's not good enough for that. Maybe you need it to be like ironclad, locked in the soil for 100 years, whatever kind of thing, if it's going to enable that bad behavior. If it's just internal in the food system, if McDonald's adds 5 cents per burger and they start giving Cargill ranchers, money to do compost application and manage grazing, if conventional like grain producers doing that on their cropland, like all of that internal work in the food system, then I feel like you want that directional progress to be made as quickly as possible. And you don't want it to be a thing where the farmer's got to take out a loan for $500,000 and then sell carbon credits 10 years later. Like, you just want the money to flow ASAP. So, whoever's asking the question, it depends, but I think it's good enough for a renewable food economy, maybe not for an offset.
I wanted to acknowledge what Rick was saying. I think Rick brought up a couple of points in here. So one, to the point of how does this work move more quickly? I wanted to highlight some of the resources that have been developed, which is plan templates for dairies. There's one for orchards, and there's one for vineyards at this point as well. And so that sort of gathers up the suite of practices that those types of producers might be looking at, and kind of provides a more streamlined pathway for them. And even kind of gives a sense of the different options that might be there, and kind of more of a checklist approach to walk through that and then customize it for your operation. And then to Rick's point as well, Comment Planner kind of sits up here, and then Comment Farm goes much more in depth as well. And so there are two tools out there that kind of work at two different levels, both of which are kind of based on proxy data and a little bit more like directionally correct. But I agree with what Anthony said as well. Good enough for right now, and let's keep moving kind of thing. And then there's another question to address about the RCDs that are doing this work. We're really fortunate here in Sonoma County that both Gold Ridge RCD and Sonoma RCD are actively engaged and have the RCPP funding to do these carbon farm plans as well. And we work very collaboratively to cover all of Sonoma County. So if you are in the eastern part of the county as well, Sonoma is a great resource for you.
Great. Any other questions from the audience?
Oh, well, there was one here from someone named Larry. So if you're up for it, I'm glad to speak to that, unless you want to tackle it, Ryan.
Oh yeah, the organics bill. There we go. Go for it.
Cool. So I don't know all that much about it, but basically there's a bill, SB 1383, to scale up organic matter diversion statewide from about 10% to 75%. So this is like a really radical change with a target date of 2025. Different municipalities are lobbying to kind of push that back a year or two because of COVID. Either way, what it means is there's going to be like a really, really huge statewide scaling up of composting and other organic matter diversion out of landfill. So this is really great news as far as I'm concerned for regenerative ag. What we're doing to try to integrate with that at ZeroFoodprint is to basically help provide the funding for the transportation and application of that resulting compost. And then there's also a paradigm where municipalities have to procure a certain amount. So this starts to get into the weeds, but we're trying to help, regional governments hit their procurement requirements also, by doing carbon farming work instead of just having them buy 1,000 tons of compost, have nowhere to put it, and then be like, well, I'll just put on the, high school football field or whatever again. And so trying to help them optimize the climate benefit by getting that compost that they're procuring onto the climate optimal, rangeland or perennial orchard or vineyard closest to the compost facility.
And yet Wendy makes a good point here that despite the state's goals that have been stated over and over and over again, the challenges to actually getting composting facilities up and running and really meeting that demand. Because again, we can put as many goals as a state as we want, but if we don't have the facilities, if we have continual barriers and obstacles that are popping up to the creation of these municipal composting facilities that can actually divert that waste, none of it matters. And so I think it's going to be, in order to actually reach those goals, we're going to need, some real incentives at the statewide level. And on top of that, we're really going to need local communities like Sonoma County to get behind the composting facilities, right? I mean, we here in this community, I think you all, and most people on this this call would remember that we lost our municipal composting facility. It was a huge loss to our agricultural community and a huge hit to any environmental standards that Sonoma holds itself to. And so, I think it's up to us on the local level to make sure that we're removing those obstacles and providing those incentives to get those composting facilities up and running. But also it's really up to the state of California to act in order to actually meet those goals, to provide the incentives, to reduce the red tape, to make it more feasible for more composting facilities to get up and running. So it's a tall order, but it's also a necessary one. And yes, Wendy makes a good point. There's the NIMBY factor. So for every NIMBY who says no composting facility in my backyard, I think we need our local community of farmers, ranchers, eaters, restaurateurs, everyone, not just the farmers, but every single person to stand up and say, no, this is important. We need to close the green waste loop and provide an organic source of fertilizer to our local farms, ranches, and even gardeners, and provide that closed loop system that we all aspire towards. So we need some YIMBYs when it comes to closing that green waste loop. So I encourage all of you to, when the opportunity arises, to speak your mind to our county and stand together to make sure that facility does get reopened. Craig, here we go. So I mentioned the work of FiberShed encouraging carbon farm plans and practices on landscapes, providing wool, cotton, and emerging markets of flax and natural dyes for fibers and textiles, which have a place in the restaurant and general lifestyle markets. I think that's a really good point, because I think whether we're talking about farm to table or climate smart farming or whatever it is, fiber oftentimes gets forgotten about. We're so focused on food, but our clothes, our textiles, those all come from agricultural sources as well, and need the same resources, the same transition, and the same level of attention when it comes to this. So any thoughts on the fiber side of things? Are you guys working with FiberShed in any capacity?
I'm pleased to say ZeroFoodprint recently awarded a grant to Bodega Pastures.
Nice.
And they are also working with FiberShed on carbon farming.
Awesome. So it's not just food producers, it's the whole agricultural community.
Well, I mean, on our end, we're food facing, so it was they sell pastured sheep and lamb and stuff.
Gotcha.
I'm going to jump in here, Wendy here. Wondering if we've got such an incredible group of attendees as well as amazing panel. If any of the panelists have any questions back to our audience, anything that you want to get some feedback on or input.
I was just going to ask, for those folks who are maybe interested in this or like part of the way down the road, like what have been some of the biggest barriers to entry for you? Like what's either missing in terms of support, or like where is there still friction in the system that hasn't maybe allowed you to like implement this as deeply as you would have liked?
I had one question about in terms of like renting land, because land tenure, I think was mentioned earlier, is kind of one of the challenges. I guess for these kinds of programs, is there a minimum number of years the land needs to be rented, or is there some sort of structure around that?
I think for most funding sources, it's showing at least a 5-year. If not, it sort of depends what you're doing. If you're doing plantings, that's a different conversation than spreading compost. Obviously, a grazer that's maybe moving animals around and spreading compost. I think that might be a shorter term sort of thing. But for something like a hedgerow planting, obviously that's quite a bit longer. So there's not a set answer per se, but some of those NRCS pools that are looking at those practices that they're investing in for the longer term would certainly require showing tenure for a longer period of time, 5 years plus.
And is there, I guess on that same note, is there any way to like, I don't know, somehow motivate or include the landlord in those kinds of arrangements?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully the landlord's in on all those conversations, since ultimately it's going to default back to them. But yeah, having them be a part of the planning process is certainly welcomed, if that's what you're meaning, and bringing them in when we're doing the goals and assessment up front, making sure that they're part of that context planning as well. I think it would be hard to proceed with funding if there was, if there's pushback from the landlord or the landlord wasn't on board. And oftentimes when you're actually signing off on the practices to get the funding, there's the landowner and then also the leasee that are signing off on doing something like that. So it oftentimes necessitates their involvement.
Great, thanks. That helps.
I think Jennifer Bice was going to jump in maybe.
For me, it's been more about getting the basic knowledge of what types of activities and the size. Anthony mentioned for them, the size doesn't matter as far as certain numbers of acreage or what would be worthwhile to get funding. But do you have any basic go-to, or would it be at your website, like hedgerows versus riparian corridors, or just kind of a description of like how much you need to do to apply to move forward with it?
Sorry, I wasn't 100% sure. That's a question for Anthony and ZeroFoodprint.
Well, you had already mentioned that the size didn't matter for you, but for the RCD, do we have to have a certain size of a farm or certain, acres of mulching or certain acres of cover crop or riparian corridors? Or
No, and there's, there is a threshold of showing a certain amount of revenue, which is quite low. I think it's, I want to say it's like $5,000 a year. So you guys would certainly pass that. But we've engaged with Scott actually for some, the drainage management and obviously the water harvesting systems on your property.
right.
Working with RCD. And if there was interest in doing additional planning, I think we sometimes assess if it if you want to do a hedgerow, it may not make sense to develop a whole comprehensive plan if it ultimately is going to manifest as just developing a hedgerow. Find a pathway for funding for just that one piece. But you all have so much going on there that I think that could develop into quite an interesting plan, and we could look at the different opportunities there with the various crops we all are growing and animals.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And I will say, for projects of that size, I'm really grateful to have someone that is a bit more of a understanding and nimble and innovative funding partner like ZeroFoodprint. And I think they really add to the funding ecosystem because they see that potential and I think kind of understand it on the ground in a deeper way. So that is a great fit for some of those practices you're going to be talking about.
Okay, great.
Well, unless there's more questions, I do want to encourage everybody to we've posted them in the chat here, but really want to encourage everybody to check out the Ridge RCD, and for those of you elsewhere in the county, check out the Sonoma RCD as well on their carbon farming plan. So lots of great resources from your local RCD. So if you haven't already tapped into that resource, I really encourage you to do so. That's why they're there. Really knowledgeable and helpful staff. So do check out the local RCDs. And for the ZeroFoodprint, this is a great opportunity and a great chance for you guys to get on this really unique opportunity. The fact that they have this focused attention on Sonoma County, we're really lucky right now. So I encourage you to check it out yourselves, but I also encourage you to tell other farmers and ranchers in your networks to check it out. So spread the word. And before we all depart here, Wendy, just wanted to pass it over to Wendy to say a few words for the evening. So take it away, Wendy.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much to our presenters. This was really a fortuitous timing, and I'm really grateful to Ryan for connecting us with Anthony, or me, because I had only heard of this vaguely and I didn't know specifics, and I definitely didn't know of this great project in focus on Sonoma County. So that's super. I wanted to give a little background and talk about what's coming up as well, because there's a theme that kind of emerged. We've got a little committee in our CAFF leadership circle that's working on wanting to have our get back to our monthly Farmers Guild gatherings like this, or at least our virtual gatherings for right now, and hoping we can start to do it in person again this summer, or definitely by the fall. And it came out of something that one of our local farmers brought up with his frustration with flat prices, as you know, for that the farm producers receive for their products, whereas their costs keep increasing. And we know how challenging it is to raise prices because so many folks are hurting financially right now. And we really don't want good food only to be available for the very, very wealthy. So it made me start thinking about, okay, alternate ways of supporting our farms. What other ways of supplementing the farm income? So that's where programs like this are just fantastic, because it can be money in your pocket without having to charge twice as much for your food, so that a lot of people can't afford it. So I think we want to offer a few more of these monthly meetings, more or less on that theme. And one of them, we've been in conversation with Karen Giovannini, our fantastic ag ombudswoman for Sonoma County, who I think is with us tonight, about some of the upcoming workshops that UCCE, our co-op extension, are thinking of hosting, and and things that we might be able to explore together. So one of the possibilities is some higher value crops that could help subsidize your lower value ones, like vegetables, fruit and vegetables. The Organic Seed Alliance is offering this intensive on seed production. And coming from the seed industry, and our previous ag commissioner used to advocate growing some seed crops. Doesn't take a lot of space, definitely a little level of skill, that you need to learn, but you can make a fair amount of money in a small area by growing some seed crops. And there's a huge demand for certified organic seed out there. Another one that maybe we could explore here would be non-cannabis medicinal herbs. We have Sonoma County Herb Exchange, and there is an enormous demand for medicinal herbs other than cannabis, where you don't have to, not all these loopholes, and not loopholes, but hurdles that we need to go through. We could have a speaker from Sonoma County Herb Exchange if you all are interested in learning more about those options. Another idea, this is maybe more alternative markets. It turns out we actually have some farmers markets in our region that are begging for vendors. I know some markets are hard to get into, but others are really looking for some. So we could have kind of a farmers market vendor fair where there's some presentations about what crops they're looking for, what kind of vendors, who's doing that. So we ask for input. I wanted to let everybody know that our chapter does have a webpage on the CAFF website, and the recording for this meeting tonight will be posted there. There's some recordings from some of our previous events, including we had a fantastic VIP tour on some local ranches back last spring that we had to do via videos, and it turned out great. That's posted. Our pitchfork and policy, a little bit about our local policy work and the work that CAFF does statewide, and about our monthly leadership meetings. So that's all on our chapter webpage. And we would love to have any individuals who want to help pull together these monthly meetings. That's one of our many, or several little committees that meet. So any help with that would be welcome also. Let's see. I think that's most of what I wanted to mention. So again, we're really looking for suggestions. We want to be able to have monthly programs like this that really offer information that would be helpful to you. So let us know what do you want to talk about? What do you want to learn about? How can we help you here in our local community? If there's any questions anybody has, I'd be happy to hear them. And other than that, again, just you can contact any of us.
Great. So really big thanks to our presenters tonight. And for everybody who came out to join us, please spread the word, share news about the funding support and then the technical assistance support as well. And we hope to see you guys at the next Farmers Guild gathering. And if you want to get more involved with the chapter, come out to swing by our leadership circle meetings. We'd love to have you. And don't be a stranger. feel free to reach out to me at any time. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you guys next time. Enjoy this rain.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Evan.